Previously in the complete creation.
So according to the evolutionary ages, it disappears some 75 million years ago. It was thought extinct until 1938 when one was caught by a fisherman off the coast of Madagascar. This one was filmed in November 2019 and you can see video footage of it kindly shared by the divers on YouTube. And you need to understand, this was like walking into your backyard and finding a stegosaurus grazing on your grass. This was an unbelievably stunning find. Hello again and welcome to part 12 of this exhaustive series on the creation-evolution debate. Thank you for joining me again and plodding through this extensive topic encompassing history, geology, biology, genetics, astronomy, you name it. All branches of the sciences. We're going to divert slightly from our previously scheduled programming. In the last part, we examined the alleged geologic column in which we have all been propagandized through education, museum displays, textbooks, the posters on the classroom walls, the media, etc. This geological column does not exist in physical form except in textbooks, museum displays, and the minds of people. Oh, and of course, multimedia productions. Now, in the last part, I believe I stumbled into the very trap of which I was trying to warn people. Whenever those words, geologic column, geologic sequence, or fossil record are used, the evolutionary propaganda has been so extensive and so effective that this is the picture that comes into the mind of the listener. I quoted an excellent paper documenting the global distribution of rock layers and its profound significance, compiled by the Honorable Dr. Timothy Clary and Davis Werner, both from the Institute for Creation Research. I specifically quoted their lines that this paper demonstrates the reality of the geologic column to springboard into my main point, that the term geologic column has literally been hijacked. Unfortunately, there was quite a bit of fallout from my referencing here, with Dr. Clary in particular taking exception to what I said in my introduction to the topic. He obviously felt my words were a suggestion to the listeners that he and Werner believed these deep time ages and evolution. Now, of course, nothing could be farther from the truth. Such a thought never even crossed my mind. It was so ridiculous. I knew full well what Dr. Clary and Mr. Werner were trying to say in their excellent paper, and that they are both uncompromising young Earth creationists. Many people had written to me or spoken to me in person after watching the last part of the series, saying they felt that I had said nothing wrong. But I have to agree with Dr. Clary. What I said and how I said it could be too easily misunderstood. So if I may, I'd like to first apologize to Dr. Clary and Mr. Werner, as any misrepresentation of them, their beliefs, or their arguments was not at all my intention, and it was in fact the opposite of the message I was trying to convey. I'd like to quickly revisit this concept because my stumbling actually reinforced the point I was trying to make. When Dr. Clary and Mr. Werner write things like, this paper demonstrates the reality of the geologic column, when the reader reads that sentence, this is the picture that is forced into their minds, whether we like it or not. The entire paradigm, with all of these evolutionary assumptions and literal propaganda, the deep time and millions of years, the evolutionary progression of life allegedly seen in the fossil sequence, this is the picture that comes to mind. It was my intention to criticize this false paradigm of the geologic column. The evolutionary propaganda has been so effective that just our use of the term geologic column or geologic sequence forces this entire demonstrably false paradigm into our mouths. The mouths of creationary researchers who do not believe these evolutionary concepts. So what I was trying to communicate was that Dr. Clary and Mr. Warner have had this entire paradigm forced into their mouths by the evolutionary establishment. It was also forced into my mouth in even just trying to discuss this topic. I admit, as someone who is trying to effectively communicate the science and philosophies of this debate, I really struggled with how to communicate this problem and avoid this trap. I thought perhaps if we introduced terminologies different than geologic column, that we might be able to more effectively differentiate between this false paradigm, which is nothing more than propaganda, and the actual scientific data, which, if anything, refutes the propaganda and supports the biblical account of an Earth thousands of years old and a historic global watery catastrophe. In fact, Dr. Clary himself had already attempted to do just that, as since the time of writing that ICC paper that I cited, he had even used different terms like stratigraphic sequence to talk about any order in the rock layers around the world. But in my attempt to use different terms, what I found was that people either did not understand the term I was using at all, or if they had any understanding of what I was trying to discuss, this was the picture that immediately came to their minds. I had fallen into the trap. I even went so far as to post a quick survey on my Facebook page to see if my suspicions were correct or false. The responses came from your average layman, truck driver, housewife, bricklayer, electrician, and several qualified and acting geologists. The responses were exactly what I expected. People responded to the different terminologies with either no comprehension, a complete misunderstanding. For example, the word stratigraphic was similar to the word stratos, as in stratosphere, and they thought it has something to do with clouds or atmospheric levels. But the majority understood my terms to mean geological relationships, and boom, this is the picture that came to their mind. In fact, one of the respondents, my fellow creationary researcher, Dr. Manny Rios, kind of called me out on my question and terminologies. I felt his response was especially noteworthy. It has been called the geologic column for over 100 years. Calling it the stratigraphic column sounds like a clever young Earth creationist tactic, but it is merely a technical term that still conveys the geologic column to non-young Earth creationist audiences and to even young Earth creationist folks not trained in geology. It is an unfortunate truth that we creationists have been forced into a corner and have had an entire paradigm forced into our mouths. So as creationary researchers, what are we to do? Because we cannot stand by silent while this travesty of science, falsely so-called, is promulgated upon our youth, our culture, and even our own minds. There is something that cannot be overstated. This geologic column is the very foundation of evolutionary theory. If you destroy this geologic column, you also destroy evolutionary theory. Let me say that again. If you falsify this geologic column, you falsify evolutionary theory. And this has been admitted in print by leading proselytizers of the evolution faith. What I attempted to do in the last lecture, and apparently failed miserably, was to separate the fictional geologic column into its separate components. The alleged fossil order and the alleged evolutionary sequence, the alleged millions of years, the alleged ages like Jurassic or Cretaceous periods, and their association with millions of years, and finally, the alleged sequence of rocks. I tried to pull this paradigm apart into individual pieces so we could examine and evaluate the actual data apart from the evolutionary presumptions that have been imposed upon the data and our minds. So in the last lecture, we separated out the rock sequence from the names assigned to the rock types and layers, and separated those names from their associated evolutionary assumptions of deep time and fossil order. We should be free to refer to Jurassic rocks as what they are, a specific type of rock with fossils that are fairly consistently found in those rocks. Not a period of time, which is a false construct, not a specific step in the evolution of life. We should be able to refer to Cretaceous deposits, free from the presuppositions forced upon us by the proselytizers of the evolutionary faith, who have painted a picture in your mind that these Cretaceous deposits would not contain certain fossils from, down here or from up here. We should be free to refer to the actual fossil finds and say Carboniferous rocks, without having those fossils immediately cast into the trash bin by disbelieving adherents of evolutionary mythology, simply because the discovery flies in the face of the evolution myth. If we find evidence of birds down here in what the evolutionary camp calls the Carboniferous age, that fossil evidence is immediately labeled an out-of-place artifact or fossil. The acronym commonly heard is OOPArts for out-of-place artifacts. There's been entire books written on that topic of OOPArts, including from secular sources, like books from the Sourcebook Project Library by the late William Corliss, or Forbidden Archaeology, a fantastic book which was a tome in itself, finding fossil evidence of birds way down here, where birds were not supposed to have evolved until hundreds of millions of years later, defies the common cliche of the evolution myth that birds evolved from the dinosaurs. As such, those Carboniferous bird fossils would be deemed out of place. Now, this is actually an oxymoron. How can a fossil be out of place? You found the fossil where you found it. If it was in situ and not just sitting loose on the beach or something, then it is simply not out of place. But rather, it is the mythology of evolutionism that is out of place. As you can quickly see, evolutionism has trumped science. So obviously, evolutionism is not science, because it takes precedence over the science, even rejecting actual fossil discoveries out of hand. As I showed last week, this alleged fossil sequence in the rock record, first of all, doesn't even exist, and even if it did, the absence of a fossil in one of these rock layers does not mean the organism was not there when the layers were laid down. Because as we saw, we have organisms around today that are absent from many of these layers. I only gave a couple of examples like the coelacanth and the Wollemi pine. There are many others. But one thing we can say for certain, based upon the presence of a fossil in a specific stratigraphic layer, is that the organism was around when that layer of rock was laid down. If we find fossil birds way down here in rocks alleged by the evolutionists themselves to be hundreds of millions of years before birds ever even evolved, then that fossil completely and utterly destroys the evolution myth. We've just turned the entire evolutionary fossil sequence on its head. This has been acknowledged by hardcore evolutionary adherents like Dr. Richard Dawkins. On the other hand, evolution makes the strong prediction that if a single fossil turned up in the wrong geological stratum, the theory would be blown out of the water. So, if a bird turned up in Carboniferous rocks, The response isn't to question the evolution myth. Rather, the response is to question the fossil. And the ad hoc explanations start to fly. Perhaps, hundreds of millions of years after the rock layers were formed, a bird fell down a crevasse in the rocks, died, and was slowly buried and became a fossil. So now it has the appearance of a fossil in the wrong time and place. Now, some of you might think that I've presented a straw man argument, that evolutionists would never suggest such a ridiculous idea. I got news for you. I've heard that argument invoked so many times in reference to ooparts that I've lost count, because it was more times than I could count, even after taking off my socks and using my fingers and toes to count. In 1964, Dr. David Mossman, who is now Professor Emeritus of Geology at Mount Allison University in Sackville, New Brunswick, was conducting a hydrologic survey near Horton Bluff in Nova Scotia. The beaches there are subjected to the incredible tides of the Bay of Fundy, as it is located right around the corner from Joggins. Dr. Mossman was a student at the time, and he and a co-student discovered a very strange trail of fossil footprints, ichnofossils. The rocks are considered lower Carboniferous period, or around 350 million evolutionary years, so older than the Joggins fossils. The identity of the track maker has been elusive for the decades that have followed. Usually, it was assumed to have been an amphibian of some kind, as according to evolutionary dogma, that's the only kind of vertebrate animal that would have been around at that time. So some suggest Eriops or Baropesia as the culprit. Now, I first heard about this trail of fossil footprints when I was touring the Joggins Fossil Cliffs with a group from the Creation Science Association of Quebec in 2003. We were given a pamphlet at the local museum and rock shop, which was in French, and it mentioned these fossil tracks and this Horton Bluff, which I had never heard of before. I have a cast here of one of these highly unusual tracks. As you can see, the footprints are huge, around 34 centimeters long. They are C-shaped with a single prominent claw off the tip of one of the toes. You can see the impression left behind by the claw in this track. It's a large claw too. The museum in Nova Scotia originally had an outline interpretation of what the ideal individual footprints looked like. I agree with their interpretation, though bear in mind the footprints varied quite a bit in shape and form. Their interpretive drawing did not include the claw impression, which you can so clearly see in many of the tracks. So in my redrawing, I added it. Now, take a look at the trail here. Here's a footprint here, 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 and so on. There are some double impressions of the tracks, and you can see that the creature was evidently fighting a current as it was attempting to walk in the soft mud. The prominent wave ripples indicate water current, and the creature was walking on a slight angle relative to the apparent current. Yet, with all of that taken into consideration, look at the trail and ask yourself the question, did this creature walk on 4 legs or 2? This was the first surprise for me the first time I saw the fossil trail with my own eyes. The answer is obvious. It was made by a bipedal creature. The Nova Scotia Museum of Natural History has subtly agreed with me through their depiction of Baropesia making this trackway. Notice they're depicting it walking on 2 legs buoyed up in the water. But here's the problem. These are Baropesia fossil footprints. In fact, these are what are called the holotype trace fossils for the creature. These were the first fossils found and given the identification and name of Baropesia. Notice the multiple prominent toes with claws coming off the tip of each toe. Compare those footprints to what is actually found at Horton Bluff. It doesn't even have a vague resemblance. And so you can quickly see the controversy surrounding these fossil tracks. Back in 2004, the curator of paleontology and geology at the New Mexico Museum of Natural History, in a presentation to the Geological Society of America, argued that these strange markings were not from an amphibian, but from the flippers of a fish. That's right. He contended that a lobe-finned fish, similar to the coelacanth, for example, made these strange markings in the mud on the sea floor. Look, I don't know how to tell you guys this, but this is getting a little ridiculous. Look again at this cast. It's clearly a very large creature which made some very deep impressions. It has two large toes, only one of which has a single large and prominent claw off the tip of the inside toe on each foot. It's a bipedal creature. Why are these very smart people struggling with the identity of this track maker and making illogical and even ridiculous suggestions as to who made this trail of fossil footprints? It is because of their evolutionary preconceptions and dogma. I believe I've identified the track maker. Immediately, most people's minds reject this suggestion. Why? Because those rock layers are 350 million years old and ostriches had not yet evolved. Let me emphasize this point because guess what? There is no other reason to doubt that identification. Not a single shred of a reason to doubt it. The footprints are a dead ringer match to the modern day ostrich. And yes, you most certainly can identify a creature by its footprints. Just talk to any skilled animal tracker. Not only can they positively identify a creature by its footprints, they can even tell you details about how it was walking, if it was injured, or in a case like this, trying to walk through fast-moving water. There's been entire TV shows made on the premise of identifying and tracking both people and animals by identifying and interpreting their footprints. Ostriches are large bipedal animals which have two large toes with a large claw off the tip of only one toe, the inside toe. The experiments I conducted with the kind assistance of Clint and Diane Cornelius at the Del Alta Ostrich Ranch in Alberta, we had their ostriches walk through deep mud. An unusual phenomenon took place when walking in deep soft mud. The ostriches rotated their feet and the second smaller toe would make a large impression, sometimes even larger than the impression left by the larger primary toe. The heel would not normally be preserved in the footprints, but in the deep mud, the heel impression was preserved, thus completing that C shape of the track. In deep mud, the joint at the back of the smaller toe would also start to dip into the mud, leaving behind this very distinct bulge in the track at the back of the second toe. Compare this ostrich track with the cast of one of the Horton Bluff fossil footprints. Large, C-shaped bipedal footprints with two toes and a single large prominent claw off the tip of the inside toe, the bulge at the back of the small toe, from that toe's joint starting to appear even in this fairly shallow impression. It's a dead ringer in all aspects. Yet, only a few hundred meters from that trail, on the same beach, famed early paleontologist and geologist Sir William Dawson excavated this slab of rock in the early 1870s. C.M. Sternberg revisited this slab in 1933 in a Geological Society of America bulletin, Carboniferous Tracks from Nova Scotia. You can see the presumed amphibian tracks preserved on the slab, but look at this. The slab had clear bird tracks on it. Note well what Sternberg writes about the tracks. Superficially, they resemble the tracks of some of the wading birds, but of course, there's little probability of their having been made by birds. Really? Well, why is that? There is only one reason he would say that. Because the evolution myth demands that he reject those fossil footprints as being made by a bird. There is no other reason. Interestingly, while one could suggest that a fossil bird might have fallen into a crevasse and become lodged and fossilized in older rock layers, the same argument cannot be said for any of these fossil tracks. They were found in situ. Entire, complete trails of fossil footprints in a right-left-right pattern cannot magically fall down some crevasse somewhere into older rocks. We have just turned the entire evolutionary fossil sequence upside down. Thus, in the words of Dr. Richard Dawkins, the theory of evolution has been blown out of the water.
Coming up in the next Complete Creation.
When we do find dinosaurs, they are usually ripped apart like we saw. When they are found articulated, they are most often found in this death pose with their heads pulled back as far as they can go.
You can catch the entire series in a variety of ways. You can watch the show online at www.completecreation.org or www.genesisweek.com. You can also purchase the Complete Creation series in full high definition on Blu-ray or video on demand at completecreation.org. Or support the Miracle Channel with a monthly tax-deductible donation and access the entire Complete Creation series in high definition through Corco, Miracle Channel's video on demand service. We need your support to keep this program on the air. So please pray for us. And if you wish to financially support the program, Canadians can make a tax-deductible donation to Core Ottawa, Canada North Post Office Box 72075, Ottawa, Ontario, Canada, K2K2P4. Or you can make a donation via PayPal online at ianjuby.org/donations. And thank you for your support.